Good afternoon and welcome to the Live Wire. I'm Meg Whalen. I'm the Director of Communications and External Relations for the College of Arts and Architecture. And today we have with us Dr. James Grymes, who is Chair of the Department of Music here at UNC Charlotte and a music historian. And Jay has written a book that was recently published by HarperCollins, Violins of Hope. So let's talk a little bit about the genesis of this book. Tonight we have a big event, a book reading and signing and some music. It's sold out, and the only way to see it is to watch the live stream, which we have the URL up, and we'll be talking about that throughout the program this afternoon. But tell me kind of how you got started in this process and what you've learned from it.
Sure. Well, the genesis of the book, Violins of Hope, lies within the Violins of Hope project here at UNC Charlotte 2 years ago. As you know, in April 2012, we brought 18 of those violins to Charlotte, to the Center City location. And that was the first and thus far the only time that the Violins of Hope have appeared anywhere in the Western Hemisphere. That was about a 3 or 4 year process to do the planning and putting all that together. And throughout that process, while the college was planning for the Violins of Hope event, I started hearing more stories about Amnon Weinstein and this project, the Violins of Hope, and I became really inspired, and I wanted to learn more. So in February 2011, I took a trip to Israel, to Tel Aviv, to visit with Amnon, and I sat with Amnon in his shop for a week and listened to him tell his story and the stories of the violin, and see the violins for myself and hold them in my hands. And it was by the end of that trip that I decided I really want to write a book. I became inspired to write this book, Violins of Hope.
Let me show some pictures. We've got pictures of these violins. Let's talk about what are the Violins of Hope and what are these instruments, and then tell us a little bit more about Amnon Weinstein. I have images here. Here are some of the violins that you saw and held and now have written about.
Sure. The Violins of Hope, it's a collection of instruments that were played by Jewish musicians during the Holocaust in the ghettos and the concentration camps. And Amnon Weinstein, this world-famous Israeli violin maker, he has spent the past 25 years now locating his instruments, and he brings them into his workshop and he restores them and brings them back to playability. And beyond that, in some senses, he allows them to come alive again on the concert stage.
And how did he first, we're seeing pictures now actually of Amnon's workshop, and this is sort of a cool picture because you not only see all the tools and a violin part there, but if you look up in the corner, there's a round mirror and you can see the back of Amnon there, which is sort of a neat picture. And here's some of the varnish and all. Tell me a little bit about how Amnon Weinstein first encountered these violins and why he decided to collect them and restore them.
Sure. Well, growing up in Israel, Amnon has always been sort of haunted by the spirit of the Holocaust. His parents immigrated to Israel in 1938, and they left their entire family behind. And it wasn't until after the war that they learned that the entire family, 400 in all, had died during the Holocaust. And from that moment on, they refused to speak about it. It was just, the grief was too much. It was too much for them to bear. And so growing up, Amnon always had this missing family. His friends would talk about Passover and their cousins coming over and their grandparents and their uncles and aunts, and he would say, you know, where's our family? And his parents really had no way to respond. And so growing up and becoming a violin maker, when he stumbled onto this Violins of Hope project, it really touched on several levels. He was a violin maker and a violin repairman first. And the first violin that he encountered with a connection to the Holocaust was actually played in Auschwitz. And the survivor had played that instrument in one of the orchestras in Auschwitz, hadn't played since, but wanted to get the instrument repaired to give to his grandson in hopes that his grandson would start playing the violin. Well, Amnon took the instrument apart, and inside he found ashes that he could only presume to be fallout from the crematory at Auschwitz. And the very thought really shook him to his core. And he wasn't quite ready to start thinking about the Holocaust. He pushed those thoughts aside yet again. In the 90s, though, he started teaching his own son how to make and repair violins. This is a craft that Amnon learned from his own father. And I believe that it was that experience when Amnon started to think about handing down the legacy he inherited from his father, to think about the larger legacy and the heritage that he had lost. And he started thinking about the role music played, specifically the violin, played during the Holocaust.
Here he is working on them. And when we hosted the North American premiere, Western Hemisphere premiere of the Violins of Hope in April 2012, we had 18 violins, but he has many more.
There are more and continually growing. He has probably 35 or so now. I spoke with him just yesterday, and there's yet another violin that's coming into the shop. So it seems every few months there's a new story we have, a new violin and a new tale to be told about the Holocaust.
So how many stories do you tell in your book?
In Violins of Hope, I'm able to tell the stories of 7 violins and the stories of what they and their owners went through together during the Holocaust.
So let's talk about, I think I have some pictures. That's actually one of our former students playing a violin when the violins were here in Charlotte 2 years ago. I do have a few here, historical images from the period of the Holocaust. This one, here's one.
That's the orchestra in the Auschwitz main camp.
Yeah, and then there's the final one. So I know you have one instrument that was played in Auschwitz. Let's start talking a little bit about that story.
Sure. Many camps had orchestras, including Auschwitz. And these were orchestras that would play at the camp gates every morning as the work details would go out to their labor, and then every evening when they would drag their tired bodies back into the camp. For the musicians who played in this orchestra, it wasn't something they particularly enjoyed. It was a form of forced labor. It was, in fact, musical torture to have to play these peppy, schmaltzy German marches while their colleagues, while their fellow prisoners were marching out. And then that didn't spare the musicians themselves. They would play while everybody else marched out, then they'd pack up their instruments and then go out for their own work detail. But then they'd be the first ones back so they could set up the orchestra again and then play these marches once more. And so for some of them, it gave them just enough to hold on to one more day. For many of the orchestra members died, but sometimes having just a little less labor was the difference between life and death. So this gentleman played in one of the orchestras in Auschwitz, and after the Holocaust, like many other musicians from that orchestra, he had no interest in ever playing again. He felt that he had spoiled his art by contributing to the Nazi concentration camp environment. And other prisoners were also, there were some who were grateful for the orchestra for giving them sort of a pep in their step, but there were many, Primo Levi's a famous example, who really resented these fellow prisoners, these fellow Jews playing these peppy marches. So after the Holocaust, he never wanted to play the instrument again. So he sold that violin to a fellow survivor who bought it for his son, and eventually that violin found its way to Israel and to Amnon's workshop as part of the Violins of Hope project.
Yeah, that's interesting. What do you think is the most exciting story that you have, that you tell of these?
One story that people find particularly inspiring, I believe that there's 7 very inspiring stories in very, very different ways, and I think that's what's interesting about the Violins of Hope book is the stories could not be any more different from each other. And so we learned that, when we're talking about the Holocaust, if it's 11 million deaths, 6 million Jewish deaths, it's easy to just become overwhelmed by those facts. But we need to remember it's not one story of 6 million deaths, it's 6 million individual stories. So I'm able to tell 7 of those in Violins of Hope, but one that people find particularly interesting is that of a 12-year-old partisan boy named Motole Schlein. Now Motole was just steps away from his family home when the Nazis arrived one day in Ukraine and shot his father, his mother, and his little sister. He escaped to the forest and eventually joined up with a legendary partisan brigade called Uncle Misha's Jewish Group. And as a member of this partisan brigade, he infiltrated a town called Ovruch in Ukraine, where they hired him to play violin at a Nazi soldiers club. And it's really an astounding story. You think of this 12-year-old boy, he was present when his entire family was killed, and here he is entertaining these Nazis. And they love him. They think he's Ukrainian. They don't know that he's Jewish. And they adopt him. They even have a German uniform and cap stitched for him that he would wear while he entertained them. But the whole time, while he's playing his violin, he's eavesdropping on their conversations. And he's looking at the types of uniforms that are being worn on their way to the Eastern Front and reporting that back to the partisans so they could use that in their sabotage attempts. He would take his lunches and dinners in the basement kitchen of the Soldiers Club. And one day he was looking around, he just happened to find an empty storeroom with a crack along the wall. And he hatched this plot to fill that crack with explosives and blow up the building and kill all the Germans inside. So every night he would sneak into the storeroom and he'd leave behind his violin, and he'd take home an empty violin case. And then he'd return the next morning with a few pounds of explosives hidden inside that case. And he'd go back into the storeroom, take out the explosives, put the violin back in the case, and then go about his day. And when he could, he'd sneak down into that storeroom and he'd break apart some of the concrete that surrounded this crack. Probably it got cracked during a bomb explosion or something. And he'd break it out, break apart the crack, open it up a little more, and pack in the explosive material. And he just waited till the time was right. And that time came when a group of SS officers were coming through over. They stopped in the Soldiers Club, and Motolet played for them all day. And he snuck downstairs, he lit the fuse, and ran out of the building and disappeared. And while he was running through the town on his way out, he looked over his shoulders and saw the fireballs into the sky. And he ran into the lake where he'd already found a spot that was just high enough where he could cross it holding his violin above his head, the water up to his neck. When he got to the other side of the lake, partisans snatched him out of the water, threw him in the back of a caravan, and disappeared back into the forest. Now Motolet was just speechless the whole experience. He was overwhelmed by the overwhelming success of his mission. So he stood there in stunned silence for a few seconds. And then finally he raised his fist to the sky and said, "That is for my parents and my little sister."
And what happened to him, and how did that violin find its way to Amnon Weinstein?
Motolet died in combat. He, of the 7 figures I read about in Violins of Hope, he is actually the only one who died during the Holocaust. And he was a brave young man, and he would do some very brave actions, and they kept saying, "Don't do this, don't do that." And he, in this particular case, they were working, the partisans alongside with the Red Army, and he noticed some German officers sneaking up behind the Red Army. And he insisted, he defied orders, in fact, to run to warn the Russians that the Germans were coming, and he did, and the Russians were able to respond and kill all the Germans that were in that particular unit. But on his way back, he was killed with a machine gun fire. And the partisan commander, Uncle Misha, who had adopted Motolet, Uncle Misha's wife and daughter had died, had been killed during the Holocaust, and Motolet became a son to him and a brother to Uncle Misha's biological son. He took Motolet's case with him. It was a very special young man, and this is their only memento of Motolet. And he took it with him when they joined up with the Red Army, and then as they went into Berlin, he was actually in Berlin when Hitler committed suicide. And then he took that violin when he immigrated to Israel after the war. He passed it down to his son, who passed it down to his son. And it was a very special family heirloom. But they didn't quite know what to do with it. So it sat in the back of a closet, just sort of collecting dust, until Uncle Misha's grandson happened to be Amnon. And at the time, Amnon hadn't even started the Violins of Hope project. They had met by pure happenstance and became fast friends. And he said, "Well, what do you do for a living?" And Amnon said, "Well, I repair violins." He said, "I have a special story to tell you someday." But it was a few years until after Amnon had started this Violins of Hope project that Uncle Misha's grandson heard about, what an amazing coincidence that this violin maker I've met is now restoring violins from the Holocaust. Boy, do I have a violin for him. And so he brought the violin to Amnon, told him the full story, and of course Amnon was just completely blown away, no pun intended, by the story of Motolet. And he restored that violin. That violin is actually now in Yad Vashem, which is Israel's Holocaust Remembrance Museum. And it's on permanent display alongside other tokens of people who defied the Nazis, alongside actually an authentic Schindler's List.
Oh, how about that? And do you know whether that violin is ever played?
It is. It was specifically donated to Yad Vashem by Uncle Misha's grandson, with the express stipulation that it be available for performances.
So tell me a little bit about your research process with this, because with each of these stories, how were you able to learn their stories, verify the history? What was the process of the research?
Well, it was a really interesting process for me as a historian, because each of the 7 chapters, the stories were in just various shapes, so I actually had to devise a different methodology to approach each chapter, because their needs were so different to be able to tell the full stories. And so that was actually quite a bit of a challenge, and quite interesting and exciting for me as a historian. So some of the story of Motole, for example, Uncle Misha, the partisan commander, wrote a biography of Motole in Yiddish. And so that was a matter of getting that translated, but then going back to the historical record of the partisans and sort of fitting in the larger historical narrative. But other stories, like, for example, this instrument in Auschwitz, since that musician sold his violin, and as it got passed down, we unfortunately don't have the name of that specific gentleman. We just know he played in an orchestra in Auschwitz. For that chapter, since I'm unable to talk about a specific individual, I nevertheless weave together a larger story by piecing together narratives of other violinists who did survive, who left interviews and memoirs and biographies. And so each chapter took a little bit of different detail to make sure the historical record was clear, but that was telling the stories of the violinist in an authentic way.
So tonight we are doing what is the first presentation of this book and your research here in Charlotte. First, tell me a little bit, because you've been doing book readings kind of all over the place the last month or so. Tell me a little bit about where you've been and where you're going to present these stories and sign books. And
yes, it's been very exciting. Violins of Hope just came out just under a month ago now. And since then, I've been very fortunate to have received invitations to speak at various book fairs. I was in Decatur, just outside Atlanta, a few weekends ago. That's the largest independent book festival in the country. And just this past weekend, I was in Winston-Salem at the Bookmarks Festival, which is the largest in North Carolina. And it's been a really interesting experience to get out there and meet the readers, people who have, even though the book's just come out, they've already gotten their copies and they've read it and they want to talk about it. And one of the most rewarding responses I've been getting are people who tell me, you know, I'm fascinated by the Holocaust, you know, my parents were survivors, and I've read everything I can find about the Holocaust, and I learned so many new things in Violins of Hope that I've never seen anywhere else. And so for me as a writer, and as a historian, that's very inspirational. But for the next several weeks, I'll be out on the road on a little bit of a book tour. I'll be in San Diego for a big book festival there. There's one in Detroit, and also speaking at some colleges and some temples and Jewish community centers. There's been a lot of interest in Violins of Hope, and that's very rewarding for me to see my work, and particularly these stories, reaching such a wide audience.
so our program is going to be a little different from what they're getting in San Diego and Winston-Salem. We actually have readings interspersed with musical performances. And of course, we do not have any of the violins here this time. We did, as we've said, have 18 violins 2 years ago in April of 2012. And at that time, we had all kinds of musicians here to perform on those violins. Some were famous international stars like Shlomo Mintz, and some were associated with the Charlotte Symphony Orchestra. And then, of course, our students were able to perform for part of those programs on some of the actual Violins of Hope. Tonight we don't have the violins, but we do have our students. Tell us a little bit about who's playing and what they'll be playing and what people might hear.
Sure. This is a very exciting evening. I'm really, really excited about it. And it is very special because we're not just presenting the stories, and the stories stand on their own as exciting, but we're interspersing those stories with music that was played, in many cases, by the very violinists that I'm talking about, or at minimal in the same places, in the same camp, in the same ghetto. This was the music that was played. So we're honoring those who suffered during the Holocaust by telling their stories, and we're honoring everybody by sharing the music that was played within the Jewish communities in the ghettos and concentration camps. It's our students who are playing, mostly violin and piano things. There is one string trio. There's a story in Violins of Hope dealing with Auschwitz. Shimon Lax was the conductor of the men's camp orchestra in Birkenau, and he just stumbled upon one day a piece of trash on the ground and picked it up out of curiosity, and it turned out to be the music to these Warsaw polonaises. He was a Polish musician himself. So he took the sheet music back to the music barrack and he arranged it for 3 string players. And they would play it in secret because Polish music was strictly forbidden in Auschwitz. And so they'd have it, and they'd have it up on the stand, and next to it would be a piece that they'd all agreed upon ahead of time. And so there was someone watching out, so if one of the SS guards were to come by, they'd give them the signal and they'd switch quickly to the approved piece. But playing these polonaises gave them a real sense of dignity to remember what life was like, that they're not Jewish prisoners, they're proud Poles. And also was a form of spiritual resistance. They were secretly defying the Nazis in their head, saying, you know, you can take this, you can take that, but you won't take our basic humanity. And so that string trio, we're going to have a string trio playing tonight.
Yeah, and to me, I think one of the things that was so interesting as a topic of conversation when we hosted the Violins of Hope, and now again as your book is published, is the fact that music can play these different roles. And of course it continues to in our own lives. We maybe don't consciously think about it, but the idea of establishing and maintaining a sense of identity through music, that music reinforcing who they were as Poles, as you say, or the fact that music served as a kind of rebellion and a way for them to demonstrate some kind of defiance. You know, I think that still happens too.
No, music is, you know, something that's very human. You know, as far back as we have human activity, we have record of music making. For a lot of us, myself included, my first memories are musical ones of my mother singing to me when I was very small, and it's those memories that we carry with us throughout our life. And I think even in the worst of times, there's many stories from Holocaust of Jews being herded into these cattle cars and just packed in on the way to camps. And they spontaneously break out into song, because in those times when we need to hold on to humanity, we go back to the music that resides so deeply inside of us.
We do want people to tune in if they're able, and so the web address is livestream.uncc.edu. And we will actually be even hosting a viewing of it in our choir room on a really big screen.
Yes, so, we want to accommodate everybody who's able to come, and so the house is full. So people who arrive tonight, if they don't have a ticket, they'll go right next door to the UNC Belk Theater to our choir room, and we have a big screen, and we'll be streaming the entire evening, and that will allow them to be part of it and to experience it, but also be present afterwards. After the event, we're going to have a reception and a book signing.
Right, and so you'll be there to talk to people, to sign their books.
Absolutely.
They can purchase books there tonight. They can have you sign, they can ask you questions, and they can be part of the reception. So even if they're not able to get into the theater, it still is a community event, and we still welcome.
I think it's going to be very exciting. We're expecting a lot of people. It's going to be a lot of fun.
Yeah. Before we close, on the screen here we have our new website that the College of Arts and Architecture developed just this fall to provide our audiences and potential audiences with a streamlined way to access information about what we're doing this year and how to come and participate in all the events. This is a major event tonight, but we put on in this college more than 100 performances and exhibitions every year. And so this is a simple arts.uncc.edu. It's a very simple website to find, and just want people to know about it and know that this is where they can come to see what's happening and to find out about parking. We do provide free parking for our performances, how to buy tickets and things like that. So you see, of course, tonight's event on the screen. We also have all sorts of other music events. The next one coming up in just a couple of weeks, our faculty brass quintet. Give us just briefly an overview of the kinds of performances, concerts, recitals that our Department of Music presents each year.
Sure. The Department of Music at UNC Charlotte presents 60, 70 or so events every single year. These range from athletic and concert bands to choirs and glee clubs to string and full orchestras, also jazz ensembles, chamber ensembles, and opera performances. And it's a real treat for our students to get out on the stage and be pre-professionals. And it's a great opportunity for folks to come to UNC Charlotte for a really cheap ticket price to see professional quality work done by students who are just on the verge of becoming great musicians.
Well, we hope people will come. If not tonight, then come. Our Faculty and Friends concert series this year will be in Rowe Recital Hall, and I think there are 6 concerts left before the the whole year ends, everything from jazz, brass, quintets, string quartets. We have 2 new faculty who are performing in recitals.
Yes, a
this
clarinet
year.
professor and a voice professor.
Voice professor. So, so we're really excited to host those. And good luck tonight with the readings.
Thank you.
And the book signing. And thank you so much for coming and talking to us
Absolutely,
about
my
your
pleasure.
project.
Thank you.
That's all for the Live Wire today. We hope that you will join the Live Wire next Thursday at 2 o'clock. Thank you.